Order. The gentlelady, Ms. Watson-Coleman, is recognized for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to you, Mr. Horowitz. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you for the work you've done. Thank you for the investigation that you've overseen here today, and thank you for the report that you've made. I'm very struck by the report that you made. 500 pages, 17 months of investigative work, 1.2 million documents, including over 100,000 text and instant messages, and interviewed more than 100 witnesses, many on multiple occasions. Am I correct that your findings as it relates to this Clinton email investigation is that the decisions that were made, the findings that were made, the investigations that were conducted were not negatively, the outcomes were not negatively impacted by the biases of any individuals?
Correct. The decision was, our conclusion was that the decision of the prosecutors was not the result of political bias based on the evidence we reviewed.
Thank you. And I am very disturbed about the behavior of many people in the FBI, starting with Mr. Comey. I find his ego exceeded his ability to discern right from wrong. I am very concerned about those individuals that had negative things to say about either one of the candidates. And I am very concerned about what I think was the failure of the leadership in the Justice Department, who seems to me to have been intimidated by Mr. Comey and not pushing back on him and not holding him accountable. Having said that, I'm tired of this discussion. I thank you for your findings. I would like for my committee, the Oversight Committee, as well as the Judiciary Committee, of which I get the chance to sit today but do not belong to look at the issues that are impacting the safety and security of our nation, our reputation, and whether or not we should be using tax dollars to try to figure out why the President of the United States of America, his administration, are doing things that are so un-American as to rip children and babies from the hands and the hearts of their parents and putting them in cages. We've seen in our history 2 times in particular that we should be so offended by. The first was slavery, when we ripped families apart and wouldn't let parents be parents to their children or wives to their husbands. And then during the World War, when we took Japanese Americans and we put them in internment camps. We have seen what this kind of behavior has done in the world when we saw what Germany did to the Jews. And now we're doing it in the United States of America. And I need to understand why my colleagues who've been elected to Congress to protect and preserve this Constitution, this republic, and this nation is sitting silently by while we consistently observe this un-American activity on behalf of this administration, coming from this administration, and their complicitness in this and their silence. I want to know why we haven't used our taxpayer dollars and our responsibility here to look at the constant violations of the Emoluments Clause by this president and his family, and how they consistently are intermingling their desires to get richer and richer and richer with our safety and security with other nations. I want to understand why my colleagues here in this room, in this committee, in the Judiciary Committee, and even in Congress are silent as we become enemies to our friends and friends to dictators. Who are we? We are better than that. I want to say that if we were going to utilize our good time, our communication to the nation, our exploration of what's right and what's wrong, what's going on, then we've got lots of opportunities from an arrogant, dismissive Secretary of Homeland Security who has not a heart in her to a president who doesn't even read the material before him. So I am feeling very discouraged by where this committee has taken us all day long. I am very discouraged by what my colleague, Mr. Hakeem Jeffries, referred to as the antics of the cover-up caucus. And before I yield back, I just want to say that we are the people for whom this government has been organized. It is of us, by us, and for us, and the people must have the final word here. Pay attention. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized, Dr. Kozar.
It's good to see you, Mr. Horowitz. Sorry you had to hear some of the ranting and raving and people talking out of both sides of their mouth. I mean, we can bring up abortion, and oh my God, how is that not the ultimate in hypocrisy? So but I'm going to take a little different tact. I want to talk about the foreign access to the Clinton email server. So what difficulties did the FBI have during the intrusion analysis process of the capacity of the servers?
Well, in terms of difficulties, what they were trying to do is understand who had intruded, if at all, and one of the challenges they had was getting the servers themselves and obviously recreating what was on the servers and what emails and evidence trafficked through it, but also the fact that foreign adversaries might not leave footprints if they did attack the server.
Right, but we didn't have all the server materials in that.
Correct.
So that leads me to my next question. So how did the FBI square its lack of the complete data with a definitive statement on whether an adversary compromised Clinton's server or system?
Well, I think one of the issues was trying to understand Director Comey's statement, where he both, in his July 5th statement, indicated that there wasn't evidence of that they had uncovered evidence of an intrusion, but they wouldn't necessarily know that either. And that was a question we had, and as we lay out here, they explained to us the steps that they took, and we questioned the individuals who were involved in the intrusion analysis.
Well, that kind of gets me back to the point. So why wouldn't you ask any and all sources like the DNI, the military, CIA, special ops, any remote centers, if they had hacked into the server during this time? I mean, because it was offline, no one really realized what this really was. This was off, the server was here. So we could ask a number of questions in regards to that opportunity of how they looked at that server. And the reason I say that is when I asked the question last Thursday as who had looked at that server, I was told that it was an individual from the FBI. Mm-hmm. So to me, that's bothersome because once again, we saw upper echelon FBI with problems with this aspect. And I'm going to come back to another aspect here. And that is there was a megadata abnormality that happened with Mr. Strzok, and Mr. Strzok blew it off. So my point is why wouldn't we go outside the FBI to look at the servers and this data?
Mm-hmm. My understanding was there was some contact with other agencies, but I'd have to go back and just refresh myself.
I'd love to know exactly who that is and who they were, because my understanding is that there's something peculiar in that regards. There were other people that noticed something totally different than what the findings that you're showing. Okay. Now I want to go back to this comment in regards. Who told Comey that reasonably likely was the proper way to explain the results for the intrusion analysis?
I don't recall as I sit here. I'd have to go back and take a look at the report.
Do you feel that you dwelled into that issue deep enough to have a thorough conversation in that?
I think to be clear, what we did was look at what the FBI did as opposed to do the intrusion analysis ourselves. Where, as an IG, Inspector General's office, we don't do an intrusion analysis. We're looking at what the FBI did to affect that.
Well, I mean, I'm going to get back to Mr. Strzok. I mean, so my understanding is he responded to the reasonably likely formation when providing edits back to Comey, did he not?
He did.
So once again, there's a common thread that we're seeing here with Mr. Strzok, not just in the parsing of words, but also in megadata anomalies, as well as looking at sources within the data. So is Strzok's edit advice to Comey not a clear example of where Strzok's bias is not publicly not too harsh on Clinton and change the public's perception on that?
Well, it's certainly a place where he weighed in and had an effect on the statement, and the had an impact on what ultimately was said publicly by Comey about whether or not there was evidence of intrusion.
Well, and I'll get back to reiterating. I'd love to know all the sources and actually have the server and these devices looked at by other groups, particularly some hotshots within DOD, DNI, to really look at this aspect, because I think there's more to the story than meets the eye. It seems to me that I'd want different validation than just the FBI. Yep. Thank you, Mr. Horowitz.
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
To make a point of order.
State your point of order.
Mr. Gosar, a moment ago, referred to a member on our side of the aisle as, quote, ranting and raving, speaking out of both sides of her mouth. I ask that his words be taken down.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think it would do us all good to make sure that we have personalities that are not involved in this, and I think it really degrades the overall importance of this issue as we bring personalities in it, whether it be with other members or others in the administration. So I think it's important. Maybe a gentle reminder would be appropriate.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would insist either on that his words be taken down or that there be an apology.
Well, I'm not going to instruct the gentleman from Arizona to apologize any more than I am other members who today have also said things that came precipitously close to the line. I will ask the gentleman from Arizona, if I may continue. If I may continue, I will ask the gentleman from Arizona if he wishes to rephrase or restate his comments in any way, or to make clear that he wasn't directing them toward any
Chairman, I was
colleague.
acknowledging that the other side has been ranting and raving about issues that are not pertinent to today's hearing, and that's what I was confronting, not just one individual person.
So it was a general comment as opposed to one directly, specifically directed at an individual colleague? Does the gentleman from New York still wish to?
Well, as long as it's clear that he was talking in general political terms and not about an individual, well, okay.
I think it's pretty clear. We will now recognize the gentleman from the great state of Texas, Judge Poe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Horowitz, for being here. You probably think you are in the lion's den. I don't think you are. You're handling the questions quite well. As the chairman alluded to, I'm a former judge, former prosecutor like you. In the justice system, we strive, whether we're prosecutor, defense attorney, judge, we strive for the goal of fairness. Whatever happens, whether it's a hearing on a search warrant, whether it's a criminal case, we strive for fairness. And things must not only be fair in the justice system, they got to look fair. And if they don't look fair, that's to us in the system, like you, just as bad as if it weren't fair. Prosecutors, when I was one, I had the rule, as you have, that prosecutors must seek justice, not convictions. That's our role when we're a prosecutor. Tried a lot of cases, and lawyers always wanted to know from the prospective jurors if they're biased, for or against one side. If they're biased, it's happy trails. They can't serve on the jury. So in this case, and it may not be an exact analogy, but here we have a jury taking place on a case. And we find out 5 of the jurors are biased for whoever they're investigating or hearing a criminal case. Neither side would tolerate that. They could not be involved in that proceeding. And in some cases, if we're proceeding in a trial and the jury's biased in the outset, there's a mistrial. We may try it again, or it may be dismissed with prejudice, depending on the severity of the bias. But in this case, we got 2 named individuals, Page and Strzok. We know who they are. We know what they've done, all of the things that you've mentioned. But there are also 3 other unnamed biased people based on your investigation, 1 lawyer and 2 other FBI agents. What are their names?
So as I mentioned earlier, Congressman, the request has come in from the committee to give their names. We went to the FBI. The FBI raised a concern because they work on counterintelligence matters, and we are working with the committee to try and get the information you've asked for to the
So the
committee.
FBI does not want their names released.
Correct.
And so the FBI makes the decision as to who those other 3 biased people are, and they say, we're not telling you because of some other internal reason on what they also work on, counterintelligence, which, whatever that means to whoever's hearing it. So my point is, we let the FBI determine not to tell us who the other 3 biased people were in this 500-page investigation that we all now have. Does that seem a little odd to you? I'm just asking your opinion.
Yeah, no, and there's a legitimate request, reasonable request from the committee, and I don't think it is a final decision at this point from the FBI, or, in my view, a final decision. It's something I'm looking forward to working with the committee to try and get the answers to, because I completely understand what the interest is of the committee in getting that information.
Well, it just seems to me that in the name of fairness, we ought to know the names of those 3 people who you determined were biased in this investigation that has taken place, this 18th-month investigation that you have been working on. I think that's fairness, and I think the American public would like to know who they are. I think in this issue, changing gears a little bit to Comey, he has done a great disservice to the reputation of the FBI. I mean, when FBI agents would walk in my courtroom back in Texas, you know, the jury wanted to stand up and say the pledge because they just trusted what they were going to say. I think now those days are over because the investigation must not only be fair, it has to look fair, and it no longer looks fair as to what the FBI is doing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How many years have you known Jim Comey?
He was in the U.S. Attorney's Office when I started in 1991 there. So sometime after I started in 1991, I obviously...
How many years do you think y'all worked in the same area? 8 years, 10 years?
No. He left, I think, within a year or 2 of my arriving to come down to Virginia to work in the U.S. Attorney's Office there. I'd have to go back and try.
And then in your position at Justice, he was at FBI, so you had...
When I became IG, a year later, he became the FBI director.
Okay. So you've known him long enough to have an idea about what his reputation for truth and veracity was among other members of his, the Justice Department and the FBI. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And what was his reputation for truth and veracity?
He had a very strong reputation.
In your report, do you ever say at any point that Jim Comey lied?
We do not.
Do you know of any time when Jim Comey has lied?
I can't think of any as I sit here.
So when President Trump said there's not a person who's told more lies in the world than Jim Comey, you would disagree with that?
I'm not going to answer what other people's views are or think. I can only speak to what my interactions with him were.
Thank
my
you.
capacities.
I know that your report basically said that Jim Comey was exceedingly careless in coming forward before the election with his reportage of the renewal of the investigation of Hillary Clinton and the laptop and Anthony Weiner. But there was no malicious intent. Is that accurate?
As to Mr. Comey, we didn't find any malicious intent.
And what he did could have possibly affected the election. You don't know that it did or didn't.
No
but it
idea.
could have, but it could have. And he also could have gone into the Trump-Russia investigation, which could have affected the investigation, and he didn't. Is that correct?
When you say go into, I'm sorry.
He could have let the public know that there was such an investigation.
The only thing I would say is he did not do that, which was consistent with policy.
Some of the attacks were made on your decision not to prosecute, or the Justice Department's decision not to prosecute Secretary Clinton, and they stem from the Justice Department and the FBI's interpretation of the legal statute and term gross negligence. The Justice Department and FBI interpreted the statute to require deliberate intent, and they agreed there was simply no evidence in the Clinton case. And your report examined this and stated, we found this interpretation of Section 793 F was consistent with the Department's historical approach in prior cases under different leadership, including the 2008 decision not to prosecute former Attorney General Alberto Gonzales for mishandling classified documents. Mr. Horowitz, did you find the Department's prosecutors investigating Secretary Clinton considered both the case law and the Department's previous decision to decline the prosecution of Mr. Gonzales?
Yes.
Can you explain to us a little bit about the decision not to prosecute Alberto Gonzales and how that was similar to or parallel to Secretary Clinton?
Well, I think the issue there, and I'd have to go back and refresh myself on the Gonzales case, but it was the fact that it wasn't being sent to a third party who, or classified information was being provided to a third party, and some of the other factors overlapped with the factors in this matter, according to the prosecutor's assessment.
The FBI has been referred to in somewhat disparaging terms since this report. Did your report find that the rank and file of the FBI were at all guilty of bias?
No, not at all. In fact, as we lay out in the conclusion here, they've worked hard to create a strong reputation. And as we know, conduct like this creates such harm to that reputation that's been built up that's why it's in part so important to address and to avoid having this kind of activity occur.
Mr. Chairman Gowdy, my friend, said that confidence in our system of law enforcement and public prosecutions is important to confidence in our government and the rule of law, and I agree with him. Would a statement to say that the FBI was a den of thieves contribute to the soured climate that we have in this country towards law enforcement and the rule of law?
You know, Congressman, I'm going to stick to what we've concluded in our report, and others can assess what they think this
is. There a den of thieves at the FBI?
We in this investigation or any others we've done, we've not identified a den of thieves.
I thank you for your service and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Tennessee yields back. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Good afternoon.
I just want to go through the report a little bit. Mr. Horowitz, is it true that regarding the FBI's investigation of Hillary Clinton?
Mr. Chairman, I think the gentleman's mic's not on.
Do I get 10 more seconds?
Absolutely not.
Mr. Horowitz, isn't it true that regarding the FBI's investigation of Hillary Clinton's email servers, also called the mid-year review, your report found, quote unquote, no evidence that the conclusions of the Department of Justice prosecutors were affected by bias or improper considerations?
Correct.
And isn't it true that the report found that decisions made during the 2016 campaign mid-year review were, quote unquote, based on the prosecutor's assessment of the facts, the law, and past department practice?
Correct.
Now, turning now to Agents Strzok and Page, it is true that your report says that their actions brought discredit to themselves, correct?
Yeah, correct.
However, it's also true that you, quote unquote, did not find documentary or testimonial evidence directly connecting these political views that these employees expressed in their text messages and instant messages to the specific investigative decisions that you reviewed.
Correct.
Now, unpack that for that. How could it be that these two individuals who texted back and forth, and I reviewed hundreds of these texts, they're unprofessional, they say bad things about Donald Trump, they say bad things about Hillary Clinton. If they knew me, they'd say bad things about me too, I'm sure. How could it be that these two individuals who are tainted by this political bias could have done what they did, and yet you say that the ultimate decisions made by the prosecutors were not tainted by political bias.
So the reason and how we got to our conclusions was by looking at all the records of all the individuals involved in the specific decisions we looked at, as well as the prosecutor's ultimate decision. And going through those records, the question was the biased evidence by those individuals translated into action by what turned out to be, in most instances, other people?
Oh, so other people were involved
Others
here. Is that
were
what you're
involved.
saying?
Correct.
Oh, so it wasn't just Strzok and Page who called all the shots on this investigation?
Certainly as to the decisions we looked at pre-July. Again, I'm separating out the October events because in that instance, Mr. Strzok was a key decision maker.
Okay, so let's unpack this. There's more than 2 people involved here in investigating the Hillary Clinton email server situation. How many other people were involved?
My understanding there was somewhere over a dozen, so whether it was in the 15 or so range, I don't have a precise number, but it was certainly in that 10 to 15, 20 range.
Oh, wow. So as many as 20 people could have been involved in basically making decisions of this group, and what you're saying is that these 2 people, though they personally may have been tainted by political bias, did not railroad the other 20 into making a decision that was politically tainted.
That's in looking at those decisions we're talking about, that's precisely the case. There was either a broader team decision or the prosecutors, not the agents, who made the decision.
Got it, got it. Now, let me take you to another point. You would agree with me that Jim Comey, although he did announce that there was an investigation into Hillary Clinton, did not announce any investigation into Donald Trump, correct?
In October, in that fall period, he did not announce the ongoing Russia investigation or, for that matter, as I said, the Clinton Foundation investigation.
Now, Strzok and Page, if they wanted to really tank Donald Trump the way that some of my colleagues assert that they wanted to do, could have leaked that this investigation was happening, but you did not uncover any evidence that Strzok and Page did that, did you?
We did not uncover evidence that they disclosed the Russia investigation, and that was one of the arguments their lawyers made as to their conduct. In
fact, there's no evidence in your report that anybody leaked evidence of an ongoing investigation into Donald Trump in Russia, correct?
We didn't touch on the Russia investigation in this. This was focused on the Clinton email investigation. I will say that obviously we're looking at the leak question. That's could be a broader question depending on what we find.
Sure, but in this report, there was no evidence.
This report does not reference that.
Correct, that's what I thought. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Desjardins, is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Horowitz, for your time and testimony here today. You did determine in your report that there was political bias against President Trump, evidenced by the Strzok Page text, correct?
Correct.
Okay. These same agents assigned to the Clinton investigation were then assigned to the Russian probe, correct?
Correct.
Do you think that this probe, the Russian probe, then could potentially have been tainted by the same political bias?
I'm not going to opine on that, Congressman. We focused in this review on the mid-year investigation. As you know, we have the ongoing work that we're doing, so I'll defer on that if I could.
But it's reasonable then, if you found agents with political bias against the President that were then assigned to the Russia probe, that certainly that is something that needs to be looked at.
It's certainly a reasonable question and something, as I said, that we're looking at in our ongoing review.
Now, I assume you watch the news?
Occasionally. I try not to, actually, as much as perhaps I have in the past. But
do you believe that there is anti-Trump bias in the news, not as Inspector General, but just as a private citizen?
I'm not going to opine on that.
You don't have an opinion as a private citizen?
I might have a private citizen opinion.
But you won't in the hearing?
No.
Okay. Would it surprise you to know that 90% of the mainstream media coverage is anti-Trump?
Again, I wouldn't weigh an opinion on that, Congressman.
Okay. Would it be safe to assume that FBI agents and attorneys watch the mainstream news?
I assume the public at large does, and since they're part of that, I assume they do.
Okay. So I guess what I'm getting at, wouldn't it be fair to conclude that some of the biased coverage has impacted their ability to fairly conduct their investigation?
I couldn't draw that. I wouldn't be able to draw that conclusion sitting here, Congressman.
Okay. While your report highlighted some of the most blatant anti-Trump sentiments within the FBI, it concerns me that this problem is more pervasive than we think. The FBI is oath-bound to remain neutral and enforce the law impartially and fairly. How can we accomplish this when there are agents that are actively biased against our sitting president?
Look, I think, Congressman, you know, having been in AUSA, worked with agents, tremendous agents at the FBI and other law enforcement agencies, the one thing I thought we all understood is you're entitled to be, and you should be part of the public, the government, the democracy that we live in. But when you get to your office, you leave your views outside the door when you walk through, and you just focus on your work, the law, the evidence, and that's what you focus on.
Knowing what you know, though, if you were the subject of the investigation and knowing that the people you just investigated were the ones doing the work, would you not be concerned?
Look, I think, again, it goes to what I just said. I was a public corruption prosecutor, and the most important thing, I supervised our unit. People who were working on those cases needed to leave whatever their views were outside the office. They needed to come in and be committed to focusing only on the facts and the law.
But that didn't happen in this case. That didn't happen, at least with multiple agents that you investigated.
Well, certainly with regard to what occurred in October, we were concerned that that did not happen.
Okay. Well, thank you for your time. I'd like to yield the balance of my time to our chairman, Mr. Gowdy.
Thank you, Dr. Desjardins. Mr. Horowitz, I'm trying to understand the drafts of the Comey memos indicated that the missing element was the failure to expose the material to potentially hostile actors. And then I'm going back to his press conference and his subsequent testimony where he said the missing element was intent. Right. So I want you to put on your old hat. It's rare when your job is to prove intent that you have a defendant or a suspect who walks in and has a card out and says, to whom it may concern, I would like to admit that I had the intent to commit a violation of each and every essential element of the offense charged beyond a reasonable doubt. I've never had that happen. Have you?
Can't recall that happening.
You have to prove intent with circumstantial. Usually it's circumstantial evidence. Rarely do you have direct evidence of intent. Is that fair?
That's fair. Although there are times people do things on camera and admit things in a wiretap that gives you pretty good evidence of intent.
Those don't go to trial that much. Sometimes those plead. When you're going to trial, the best you can have sometimes is circumstantial evidence.
Sometimes that is the best.
Right, such as false exculpatory statements, false non-exculpatory statements, concealment, destruction of evidence, knowledge, absence of mistake, notice of wrongdoing. I can't think of a better source for that potential circumstantial evidence than the actor, the target, the defendant, himself or herself. Can you?
That's usually where you find some of your best evidence.
All right, I'm out of time. If any of my colleagues give me any more of their time, I want to close the loop on how to prove this missing element and whether or not, in your judgment, in this case, a fulsome effort was made when they did interview the target. With that, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson.
Microphone.
This one's working. Okay, Mr. Chairman, between Republican-led committees, there have been numerous hearings on the topic of Hillary Clinton's emails. Hillary Clinton has been the gift that Republicans can't get enough of. The American people will recall that during the run-up to the 2016 presidential election, House Republicans held numerous hearings about then presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. We remember what House Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy admitted when he told a reporter, quote, "Everybody thought Hillary Clinton was unbeatable, right? But we put together a Benghazi special committee, a select committee. What are her numbers today? Her numbers are dropping. Why? Because she's untrustable," end quote. Well, Mr. Chairman, the day finds us again mired in another hearing about Hillary Clinton's emails, and instead of holding hearings to muck up Hillary Clinton, Today we're holding this hearing hoping that the American people are distracted from important issues of today. As chants of "lock her up" fade from our memories, our consciences are being disturbed as we hear the ProPublica footage of the little children crying, "I want my mama, I want my daddy." As I prepared for this hearing last night, all I could hear were the cries of those children being held in private for-profit jails, crying out for their parents. Mr. Chairman, I think we should have hearings about how the Trump administration is deporting their parents as those children remain wards of this country. And we also can be looking into issues like what was reported last week, the New York Attorney General's investigation and criminal referral to the Department of Justice. The same day that the OIG report came out, New York Attorney General, his office, or her office, sued Donald Trump, his children, and the Trump administration with alarming allegations about flagrant violations of the law and potentially criminal acts. The New York Attorney General found, and I quote, "In sum, the investigation revealed that the foundation was little more than a checkbook for payments to nonprofits from Mr. Trump or the Trump Organization. This resulted in multiple violations of state and federal law because payments were made using foundation money regardless of the purpose of the payment. Mr. Trump used charitable assets to pay off the legal obligations of entities he controlled, to promote Trump hotels, to purchase personal items, and to support his presidential election campaign. The complaint included images of emails from campaign staff such as Corey Lewandowski directing political spending out of the foundation's accounts. It included a note clearly in the president's own handwriting directing foundation money to be used to settle a lawsuit against Mar-a-Lago, his country club estate for the ultra-rich. This is simply stunning. The New York Attorney General alleged that there were, quote, multiple violations of state and federal law, end quote. The New York Attorney General sent an official criminal referral letter to the IRS and also to the Federal Election Commission to investigate tax and election law violations. The letter to the FEC copied an official from the Public Integrity Section of the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice. Now more than ever, we need strong and independent oversight to ensure that federal law enforcement and prosecutors can do their job free of political pressure. Based on the President's past statements and actions, I have serious concerns that he or his political allies will attempt to make this new potential criminal case go away. And so I think we will once again need to rely on your office, Mr. Horowitz, for that oversight. Can you commit to us here today that your office will look into this criminal referral to ensure that there is no improper outside influence or inside influence, for that matter, including any attempts from the President or his staff to shut down an investigation into the conduct of the President or his family?
So certainly matters that are within our jurisdiction and our authority, we're prepared to conduct appropriate oversight on. There are some things that will be within our jurisdiction, some things that are not within our jurisdiction, and I think it really depends ultimately on what comes to us in terms of a referral or not, if and when one does come. So that's what I can tell you on a hypothetical, but that is why we're here as Inspector General Office, and if it's within our jurisdiction, we will obviously take any referrals and look at it carefully.
I thank you for your exhaustive investigation in this report. I think you've done a great job, and I thank you. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, did Lisa Page work on the Hillary email investigation?
She did.
Did she work on the Russian investigation?
She did.
Did she work on the Mueller investigation?
Yes, she did.
When you or your people asked her why she used her FBI phone for personal purposes, what did she tell you was the predominant reason?
Well, as she indicated, she and Mr. Strzok were having a relationship, and they were using the phone to communicate with each other for that purpose.
To cover up the affair, to keep their spouses from knowing?
Yeah.
So she texted something that you asked her about. This is an April 1st, 2016 text. I want you to tell me why she told you she sent this text. She said, so look, you say we text on that phone when we talk about Hillary because it can't be traced. You were just venting because you feel bad that you're gone so much, but it can't be helped right now. What did she tell you was the reason she sent that to Strzok?
She told us this was an example, and I'm looking at our report here, why she had used the phone to keep this information from her spouses, and this was an example of that.
And in this text, she said she was coaching Strzok, basically, on what to tell his wife, correct?
Correct.
So she was telling him how to lie. She was using a government phone to tell her husband how to cover up an affair, coaching him on how to lie, and using the pretext of this investigation to carry out this affair with her coworker. So she coached her coworker and lover on how to lie to his wife, used government resources to do it in the pretext of this investigation to conceal what they both knew was immoral behavior. Did that give you any reason to doubt her testimony to you in the interviews?
I think, frankly, as to all the individuals, when we go in, we come in with a healthy skepticism, as you would expect us to, and I think we treated her no differently than when we treat others in terms of going in and looking. And I think, as you can see here, we express our skepticism of some of the explanations we got.
Your report's really good at uncovering bias. I want to talk about some bias that has been uncovered by your report that's not been covered in the news. I want to read you 5 texts. March 12, 2016, page forward in an article about a conservative candidate in Texas stating, "What the F is wrong with these people?" Strzok replied, "That Texas article is depressing as hell, but answers how we could end up with Trump as president." August 26, 2016, Strzok sends to Page, "Just went to Southern Virginia Walmart. I could smell the Trump support." August 29, 2016, Agent 5 to Agent 1, "I would rather have brunch with Trump and a bunch of his supporters like the ones from Ohio that are retarded." October 28, 2016, Agent 5 lists things that he's sick of, and he lists on there the average American public. And then on November 9, 2016, unnamed FBI employee says, "Trump supporters are all poor to middle class, uneducated, lazy POS." We know what that stands for. "That think he will magically grant them jobs for doing nothing. They probably didn't watch the debates and aren't fully educated on his policies." This is bias of the FBI at the top level. I'm not saying at the field agent level. They probably more reflect the American people. But at the top, highest, most level, you have a bias against the American people. And this terrifies the average worker who's paying their salary with their tax dollars. So I think that's something we need to look at. I want to yield my remaining minute to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Horowitz, James Comey, Director of the FBI, Andy McCabe, Deputy Director, Chief of Staff Jim Rubicki, General Counsel Jim Baker, FBI Counsel Lisa Page, and Deputy Head of Counterintelligence Peter Strzok. These were 6 important people at the FBI, is that right?
Correct.
And they were the key players on the Clinton investigation and on the Russian investigation, correct?
They were certainly important on both.
Has Mr. Comey been fired?
Yes.
Has Mr. McCabe been fired?
Yes.
Did Mr. McCabe lie under oath, according to your report?
In our view, yes.
Yeah. Is there a criminal referral for Mr. McCabe?
I'm not going to comment on that.
Has Mr. Rubicki left the FBI?
Yes.
Has General Counsel Jim Baker left the FBI?
Yes.
Was he removed from his position prior to leaving the FBI?
I'm not sure of that.
Has Lisa Page left the FBI?
Yes.
Was she reassigned prior to leaving the FBI?
I believe so.
And has Peter Strzok been removed from his position as Deputy Head of Counterintelligence?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Horowitz, you've been in the DOJ for 10 years. You've been Inspector General for 6 years. You're Chief of all the Inspector Generals. Have you ever seen anything like this at any other federal agency in your time in the federal government? 6 of the top people fired, demoted, reassigned, or left?
I obviously can't speak broadly to other areas that I haven't known before, but yes, this is
I've been in this town 11 and a half years. I've never seen anything like this. Even the IRS scandal didn't come close. Never. And again, this is not in any type of reflection on the rank and file agents who I know you respect, we all respect, and do a great job. But these were the 6 key people. I have never seen anything like this in my time in government. My guess is there's not a person on this dais who has as well.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Maryland, Professor Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Horowitz, our committee seems deeply lost in the forest today. A lot of my constituents are baffled why at a moment when the U.S. government is separating thousands of children and parents at the border in a way that threatens to make us an international pariah, the Judiciary Committee and the Oversight Committee are doing nothing about this scandalous policy, but rather seem stuck in a time warp doing another investigation into an investigation into an investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails. The amazing thing is that the majority chose to re-enter this maze when your report was perfectly clear on its findings, and I quote, "We found no evidence that the conclusions by the prosecutors were affected by bias or other improper considerations. Rather, we determined they were based on the prosecutor's assessment of the facts, the law, and the department practice. Indeed, you seem to find that the major case of prosecutorial wrongdoing here took place at the expense of Secretary Clinton. While Director Comey properly kept secret the FBI investigation of the Trump campaign's involvement with Russian agents throughout the campaign, he repeatedly ignored department policy to release information about the Clinton email investigation." Mr. Horowitz, did you make a finding about why Director Comey violated DOJ policy and tradition in the Clinton case while steadfastly refusing to talk about Trump-Russia? This might have cost the Democrats the election, and Comey, of course, was a lifelong Republican. Was he motivated by partisanship and bias? Was that something that you found?
We did not find that Director Comey's decisions were based on political bias.
Do you think we're making a mistake not to blame that decision on partisan bias because he was a Republican?
Again, I'll stick with our finding, which is that we did not see evidence of political bias.
Well, all of this seems to come down to, in my view, the text in this sophomoric texting relationship between Strzok and Page, a couple now made almost as famous as Bonnie and Clyde or Romeo and Juliet by this committee. We've all read and heard these titillating messages between the two. Sure enough, they don't like Donald Trump. They're very snarky about him. They called him an idiot. They were also snarky about Eric Holder, Chelsea Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and my good friend Martin O'Malley. So if the question is whether they like Donald Trump, of course not. They called him an idiot. But your job as the Inspector General is not to diagnose their private biases as government employees, but rather the character of their public actions. Mr. Gohmert seemed to think it's sufficient to disqualify public prosecutors or investigators because of their private biases. And I'm wondering whether you could illuminate for the committee the difference between a private bias or a political opinion someone might have and a public bias that actually gets activated in the character of a public investigation or policy.
I think fair to say if you are involved in a democracy, whether you're an federal prosecutor, an agent, or just a citizen going about your business, you have views, political views. You vote, you have positions. That's what you would want people to do and be engaged in democracy. When you are a law enforcement agent, when you're a federal prosecutor, you have to understand and appreciate that whatever your views are as a citizen, you keep them outside the office and away from your decision-making. And what was troubling here is, and I understand the explanation that was provided to us by Mr. Strzok and Ms. Page, that they thought these were private, but they weren't. They were using their FBI devices, sometimes at work, sometimes not at work, to speak about individuals they were investigating. So they weren't just speaking about a generic election that they cared about. It just so happened that the people they were speaking about had a connection to the investigations they themselves were working on, and in some instances, they tied that discussion to their investigative work, and that's what's concerning.
Okay. When these text messages came out, it turned out that that representatives of the Department of Justice actually convened a select group of reporters in advance to show them the texts, and there was great mystery about why that happened. Have you made any progress in investigating why this was leaked in advance by the Department of Justice to certain reporters?
Yeah, we haven't undertaken a full investigation of it. We made clear that to the committee that we were unaware of that until after it happened and we got complaints in from it. We were told it was considered by the department and by its lawyers. And so, as you know, the IG doesn't have authority over decision by lawyers in the course of their legal authority. Under the IG Act, those go to the Department's Office of Professional Responsibility, and so they would be the ones that would have to be consulted as to what they ultimately found.
So you're doing no further investigation?
We don't have jurisdiction, actually, because what we first learned right away was that lawyers had been consulted and lawyers had given advice. And once that happens, while we would, and the committee has supported giving us that jurisdiction, at this point, we don't have it.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, thank you, and for your entire team, some of which are Republicans, some of which are Democrats, some of which are unaffiliated. I thank you for your unbiased way that you conducted this comprehensive report. And just for the rest of the team at large that's probably back at DOJ watching this. And so I want to get right to the heart of the matter. One of the concerns I have when we look at bias in the analysis that you made at the very end, it is incumbent upon any team to make sure that they do the investigation without bias. And it's clear that Peter Strzok and Lisa Page had some bias. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so if you were to learn that they had a disproportionate role in the investigation, both on this investigation and the Russia investigation, that would mean that their bias would have a disproportionate contribution to that decision, would that not?
Yeah, and I'm going to stick to this review since I know this one at this point, but yes, that would be a concern.
So let me go further. You're the one that actually discovered the text messages.
That's correct.
Your forensic team.
Correct.
So why would the FBI not have been able to find that?
So
did they look?
Well, the first batch we recovered in 2017,
right,
we found because we asked for text messages.
All right, and so they produced them to you.
They produced them to us. Then we
So the ones that you
more.
found forensically,
correct,
why did they not find those?
If you didn't do the forensic work on the phones, you wouldn't have found the text messages.
So they really just didn't look, is what you're saying. The
Nobody
FBI
had
didn't
looked
look
beforehand. Correct.
So you looked, but they didn't look.
They hadn't looked.
So was it a lack of curiosity on their part?
I
mean,
because
you're the one.
the FBI on that as to why they didn't.
Well, but if
take
they
that
were
effort.
really serious about oversight and really serious with the confines of these text messages, I think an investigator would want to know if they had bias within their own agency, wouldn't you?
Yes, and I would just add, we've had those phones in our custody for probably about a year now or 6 months now. So just to be clear, we've had them for the last 6 months.
Since then. Well, you've done a lot more with them than they did, and I'll give you that. And so I want to focus on what's not in the report, because as we look at what's not in the report is, as you know, the intelligence community, IG, actually was part of the predication for this investigation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
They were so concerned that there might have been foreign infiltration into this that they went immediately to the FBI to let them know about that. Is that correct?
I know they went to them. I don't know the sort of.
Well, I talked to the IG, and he indicated that he went literally that day, got in a car, went over and met. And so he was really concerned that there was some anomalies in the metadata that would suggest that a foreign actor was getting copies of potential emails. Are you aware of that?
I am, and I've talked to him as well.
Okay. And so if they are that concerned, do you not find it curious that the FBI investigators, Peter Strzok and his team, did not ever talk to them other than that initial meeting where they did that? Would you think that part of an investigation would be to go back to the very people that brought up the accusation and say, what did you find?
Yeah, I assume that would be what
But that's not in your report.
That's correct.
And they didn't do that, did they?
I'd have to double check that.
Yeah, I can tell you that the last time that they talked to them was when they gave the referral to close it out after the Comey incident. So wouldn't you find that curious, that they wouldn't have looked any further?
If they didn't, yes.
All right, and so you can get back to the committee on that. All right, so let me go on a little bit further. So if they didn't look, and if we don't have that information, your staff indicated that indeed emails with at least some classified information did go to a foreign entity or a third party.
Yes, one of the individuals who was on Secretary Clinton's staff, his email account, private email account, Gmail account, was hacked.
Right, and so let me look at 4 other things that I need you some clarification, because there's some text messages. We know that Peter Strzok worked on both the Russia and the Hillary investigation, so I want to make sure that these text messages don't apply to Hillary. So on July the 29th, before the investigation into the Russia investigation started, there was a text message that says, do you want us to reach out to Gervais? And I think they're referring to Gervais Griggs at that particular point. And they said, well, why do you want to do that? Well, we want to see if he actually has the names that we already have. Now, I'm troubled by this a little bit. Did that apply to the Hillary Clinton investigation? It was already closed.
It was already closed. I'd have to go back and double check.
Okay, why I'm curious is why would they be checking with someone who his specialty is, quote, FBI advanced electronic surveillance? Why would he be checking before a Russian investigation is open with somebody who does essentially bugging and monitoring to find out anything that might have been going on? Why would that have happened?
I don't know.
Okay. So let me go on a little bit further then. The text message that says the White House is running this, which happened on August 5th, was that in reference to Russia or Hillary Clinton?
Our assumption and understanding was it was not Hillary Clinton's matter because that had been closed already.
That's my assumption as well. And the one that says that the president wants to know everything about this that happened on September 2nd, was that with Hillary or with the Russia investigation?
Our understanding is that would not have been Hillary, that would have been the Russia matter.
Yeah, so looking at the difference between the way that the Hillary Clinton investigation was notified and researched versus the way that it appears that the Russia investigation, did the administration, the previous administration, take an abnormal interest in all of that?
The gentleman's time has expired, Mr. Inspector General, but you may answer.
I don't know the answer to that at this point because that was not part of this review, but certainly it's something we, as we look at the matters that have been recently referred to us, we will be considering.
I thank you. I'll yield back.
The gentleman from North Carolina yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized. Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. I want to see if we can summarize your findings after a long day going through your testimony. Do you agree, yes or no, that Hillary Clinton committed no crimes?
Our finding is that the prosecutors looked at the facts, the law, and the evidence to conclude she shouldn't be charged.
Okay. Do you agree, yes or no, that Page and Stroked acted inappropriately?
Yes.
And you agree that they were removed by Bob Mueller from his team?
He was removed. Ms. Page had already returned prior to our notification to the special counsel.
You agree that Director Comey never leaked the Russia investigation, the existence of it prior to his testimony to Congress?
He did not disclose it back at the time period we looked at.
You agree there's no evidence that Jim Comey lied to you in your investigation?
We did not make any finding that he lied to us.
Mr. Horowitz, do you think it's time to move on past the Hillary Clinton emails?
I think we've put forward our report. Congress has a separate oversight authority and interest, and I'm not going to speak to what Congress should or shouldn't do.
Because again, I appreciate your work on this, and I think it was fair findings all around, but the only text messages that I really care about right now are the hundreds of people at home and across the country who are asking me, what in the hell is the Judiciary Committee doing right now? I mean, this is maddening. I don't know if my colleagues are checking your voicemails or checking your emails or checking your Twitter feed. People aren't talking about the goddamn emails. They're not. They're talking about kids separated from their mom and their dad sitting in cages on our southern border. And then they say, hey, Congressman Swalwell, which committee is responsible for that? And I tell them, well, it's the Judiciary Committee. Great, so when you get back to Congress on Tuesday, you guys are immediately going to look at why this is happening, right? No. We're having a hearing, I tell them, but our hearing is on Hillary Clinton's emails. You know how upsetting that is? That's upsetting to Republicans, Democrats, people who don't give a rip about politics. This is important. People should be held accountable for inappropriate behavior, Mr. Inspector General. And again, I appreciate that you're doing that. But our responsibility is to act on behalf of the American people. And we're not helpless. We're actually the one committee in Congress that is not helpless to act when families are being ripped apart. So I would ask Chairman Goodlatte, please interrupt me if you intend, when we conclude today, to hold a hearing on how we're going to prevent future families from being separated and reunite those who have already been torn apart. Mr. Gowdy, again, interrupt me if you have a plan for what we're going to do next, what I can tell my constituents. Because the only thing they care about right now is that the United States that they know is no longer a compassionate one.
The gentleman may be pleased to know that on the floor on Thursday, as soon as Thursday, there will be a bill to address the very problem the gentleman is talking about. But it has nothing to do with the importance of making sure that the Federal Bureau of Investigation does not repeat what it did in 2016 and into 2017.
In reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman, I understand that's a partisan bill without Democratic support, and that did not come through this committee. Again, we have an opportunity to act now. I saw Mr. Meadows at the White House today, and Mr. Meadows, I was encouraged by what you said, that families shouldn't be ripped apart, but here we sit, we're asking questions.
Well, if the gentleman will yield, yeah. I have a nonpartisan bill that does not deal with a wall, does not deal with sanctuary cities that I introduced an hour ago. If he would like to co-sponsor with me,
let's work on
bring
that.
It.
Yeah,
we'll bring it together.
Let's work on that, Mr. Meadows, because my constituents, and I think all of our constituents, want to make sure that we show compassion, that we show heart, and that Congress acts. There's consensus on this issue. And it's just maddening that the one committee that has the responsibility to do something is focused on this. Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. DeSantis, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, with the Wiener laptop issue, I think that you had said Peter Strzok's explanation for his conduct was not really persuasive.
Correct.
And so it would be reasonable for somebody to infer that his actions, at least with the Wiener thing, were motivated by his bias?
And that was precisely our concern.
Okay. July 31st, Strzok, this same Strzok, that's bias affects how he's handling the Wiener laptop, opens up a counterintelligence investigation against Trump's campaign. Why? We're trying to get the reason. Some guy made a comment in a bar, so he opens up an investigation. 8th of August, he's asked, Trump can't be president, right? No, he can't. We'll stop it. Why was that text message not originally produced to you? What did the FBI tell you?
So what appears happened is that its collection mechanism, the program it used, was not collecting all the text messages.
But you had every other text message from that day, correct?
Actually, I don't know the answer to that. I thought I did, but I'm not sure.
So when you guys went back recently and got this damning one, was that the only one from that day that you found that was new?
I'd have to go check, but there was at least one other. Actually, there were several others, but at least one other relevant to our review that we had not seen before that we found as we went back through it.
And that was, so is their explanation that it was not human agency, that it was some type of glitch?
Right.
Okay, well, look, this is the most damning one of all.
Correct.
I guess theoretically possible could be the glitch. I need an explanation for that. Now, the 16th of August, the infamous insurance policy text message. They have a scenario thrown out in Andrew McCabe's office that Trump can't win. Strzok says, no, we can't take that risk. We need an insurance policy. Their explanation that, oh, we don't really know, we don't really remember the meeting. I mean, was it persuasive or credible how they explained that text message?
It wasn't persuasive to us.
It was. Totally not at all. And so here's the thing that I get with the insurance policy. If the investigation was validly predicated into Trump's campaign, who the hell cares whether he was going to win or not? If it's an investigation, you should want to do it. This tells me that they're saying, well, heck, if the guy may win, then we have to do this. Peter Strzok, the same guy, said, we'll stop him, who opened this up on the 31st of July based off some errant comment in the bar. This stinks to high heaven. Let me ask you this. The 3 other FBI agents who you're not naming, you said because they're involved in counterintelligence, correct?
Not me. The FBI has asked.
Well, why did we get Peter Strzok's name, though? That's what I don't understand.
Well, so what we do is when we prepared the report, we do an analysis under the Privacy Act federal law, and our determination was that because of the level he was at the agency, Deputy Assistant Director, the Privacy Act balance weighed against him, and we would make it public. As to the others, they're lower down.
Okay. Now,
the balance went the other way.
2 of the 3 had worked for Mueller. Is that
That's my understanding.
Do they still work for Mueller?
That's my understanding is no.
Okay, so they both did they get removed because of bias?
I believe at least one of them, and I can double check this, was
that the one
removed after we alerted again the special counsel to the text messages. It may have been both of them, but I think it was one.
Is it fair to say that your investigation identified a culture of leaking in the FBI?
That's precisely what we say here and is a very big concern.
Okay. Let me ask you about the Clinton-Lynch tarmac meeting. Was there any, is that plane monitored in any way, either audio or visual monitoring, Lynch's plane?
I don't believe there's audio monitoring.
So you were never given any type of document that memorialized any conversation between the two
not
of
at
them?
all.
Okay. And what was your report's view of Lynch's explanation for the meeting? I know it was about a 20-minute meeting. She said it was about grandkids.
Yeah.
Could you fill up? I don't think she has grandkids. So what did you think? How did you guys view that?
I think we laid out there what the explanation was from former Attorney General Lynch, President Clinton. That was the sum total of the evidence that we had. And they both explained, and we detail here what they said occurred during the meeting. And that is the basis for our evidence at this point.
Comey in his statements to you guys said that there was, they were grappling with the Hillary stuff. There's no evidence of willfulness. But was there any doubt that Hillary intended to create a separate server? I mean, that was done willfully, correct?
Yeah, that was never the question.
Okay, so the question is, if you take a willful action and there are certain consequences that are reasonably foreseeable, I mean, there's certainly aspects of the law where you would be held liable for that. So you're setting up a parallel system, knowing you're going to conduct the main business of Secretary of State, one of the most sensitive positions in our government. The idea that Comey's acting like, oh, there was just no willfulness here, I didn't really find his explanation credible. I know you guys have looked at it, but I just wanted to put that on the record. I'm out of time, so I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from the Virgin Islands is recognized, Ms. Plaskett.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Horowitz, for being here. I have since, I'm further down in seniority, I have the ability to now ask you some questions trying to clarify what my other colleagues were discussing with you. In your discussion with Mr. Meadows, there was a question that the text sent between Mr. Strzok and Ms. Page discussed the White House running this. You said you assumed that this text was not referring to the Clinton email matter and that you assumed it referred to the Russia investigation. I just want to clear up. Do you actually know who the text was referring to?
I'm sorry, when the particular
The text that says the White House is running this.
No, I think it was my understanding, just a general reference to the White House. I don't know if there was a particular person.
And if it was to discuss the Russia investigation, it's not the Russia collusion investigation by the special counsel. It's referring to the Russia election interference investigation, right? We have so many investigations here. Let's keep them in line. Now, also in your discussion with Mr. Meadows, there seemed to be some logical analogy that was made, and as an attorney, that's one thing that we look at is the logical inferences, and I wasn't sure if it was necessarily correct. The discussion was that if you have a person who has a disproportionate bias in their personal, that you also then have to look at their disproportionate amount of decision-making in determining how that. Is that necessarily how one determines if their bias, in fact, affects the outcome?
I had understood it as that they would have a disproportionate, given their role, impact on decisions that were made.
Okay.
And that may be
and that's if their personal bias then bled into their work as well, correct?
Correct. And I think that I think in terms of answering, it wasn't, was there did they in fact cause an impact, but rather, given their role, did they have a disproportionate?
So the disproportionate bias of Page and Strzok in terms of their bias against now President Trump, was that disproportionate in size to their decision-making?
I wouldn't know, you know, as I said earlier, I don't have precisely which decisions they made over this period of time.
Let's move on to someone else who may have had a bias. My former boss, Director Comey, was a Republican, was he not?
I've read that. I don't know at the time.
I worked with him in a Republican administration.
I've heard also he changed his
by.
registration, so I don't know what the
So I worked with him in a Republican administration when he was the Deputy Attorney General of the Justice Department. Would his bias as a Republican and him being the decision maker have affected why he decided not to leak or not to discuss the Russia investigation itself?
Our concern about what Mr. Strzok did was what Ms. Page does wasn't based on their political affiliation, but rather on the text messages. So whether
Did
Mr.
you know
Comey
their political affiliation?
I do not know their political affiliation.
But we know the affiliation of Mr. Comey, but we're not going to count that against him?
I think you have every right to register with whichever political party or none at all, and that
Sure, because we are still a democracy, are we not?
Correct.
But listening to my colleagues, it would seem that if anyone has a personal opinion about someone, that it should automatically exclude them from working in the FBI or working anyplace else, and that justices should not be blind anymore.
I don't think, and I don't think I've suggested that your personal opinion prohibits you from working in the FBI or the Justice Department. The concern here are the text messages that they exchanged about people that they're looking at.
I mean, before the election, many of my colleagues had a bias against Trump. But it appears now that he's the chief executive that they've all fallen right in line and follow right behind whatever he says, even though many of them made public statements against him and against some of the opinions that he had before he became president. In your investigation, you said you looked at 1.2 million documents, correct?
Correct.
And in those documents, which are now being subpoenaed by Chairman Gowdy as well as Chairman Goodlatte, on the documents for investigation on the FBI's handling of Secretary Clinton's emails, have you had access to all of the documents that the Justice Department has subpoenaed but haven't received? Isn't that correct?
That the Justice Department, you mean the Congress has subpoenaed? Sorry.
Correct, yes.
Yes, we've had access to all the records.
And your office was able to review those documents and any other documents that's needed as part of your investigation for this report?
Correct.
And your report concluded, and I quote, "We found no evidence that the conclusions by the department prosecutors were affected by bias or other improper considerations. Rather, we determined that they were based on the prosecutor's assessment of the facts, the law, and past department practices." Correct?
Correct.
And so I just want you to be careful, because now that you have not followed the conclusion that the Republicans would like you to, you may in fact be up for a special counsel investigation yourself, and I yield back.
On that sobering note, Inspector General Horowitz, we will now go to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could take it just a moment, I'd like to say thank you for your leadership. You have been the voice of justice, not just for today, but for more than 7 years. I have no doubt that you will continue to be a warrior against injustice and for the underprivileged, and I'm proud to have served with you and call you my friend. Mr. Horowitz, you previously testified that during the investigation, you found additional text between Agent Strzok and Page on FBI devices, which the FBI had not analyzed, including text about meeting in Andy's office. I'm assuming that wasn't Andy Griffith, Andy Cohen, or Andy Rooney. The closeness of referring to Andy bothers me a little bit, because evidently it says there may have been some relationships. Of course, according to your words, according to your report, somebody denies. Which one denies that meeting happened? Is it former FBI Director Andrew McCabe, or is it Peter Strzok?
I think the denial is that Mr. McCabe says he does not recall being present for that meeting.
Doesn't recall being present for that meeting. Have we investigated that further? Have you referred that to be investigated further? Because that's a pivotal point in all of this as far as what was said, who was involved in these meetings, whether there was intent or whether there was bias.
I think we have investigated, frankly, as far as we can take it, and could find evidence to see whether he was present. And you know, we've laid out here what we found ultimately.
Does it concern you that the FBI did not further investigate this issue of these discovered text messages. Seems like it raises larger questions with some of the behavior at the FBI. Does that offend you, bother you?
What has concerned us is that the FBI has this imperfect system of collecting records, has known that for some time, and needs to get it fixed. Frankly, once we started looking at these text messages, we were going to be the ones who kept digging to get them. So I didn't expect at that point the FBI to...
Fair enough. Because of Strzok's actions, I have a question. Can you with certainty express that the Hillary Clinton investigation was without bias or interference?
I cannot speak to every single decision that was made. He might have been involved in, and so I can't speak to that broader point.
So you're not saying that there wasn't bias. It appears that you are saying that bias may have existed in all of this, but not to the place that you could prove that it influenced the investigations.
Where we looked, on the decisions we looked at and the prosecutor's decision, we made the finding we felt we could make.
Do you understand why the American people are having some trouble with all of this? When you began to talk about, well, there's biased behavior, but is it a subjective call to where that bias level may have reached, whether it influenced? The amount of time that Peter Strzok spent as the lead investigator, do you understand why the American people would be upset, at least the appearance of all of this?
Absolutely, and I'm upset at all of this. I think it's precisely why it casts a cloud over the investigation. It undermines confidence in it. All of those impacts are very serious and very significant on a very important FBI investigation. That should never happen, and it happened because of these text messages and what these employees were doing.
Sure.
It should not have occurred.
Well, thank you, and it's one of the reasons that you're respected on both sides of the aisle. I do remember, in fact, it might have been my question or another member on the House Oversight Committee, that when asked former Director James Comey as far as why not to bring charges, I believe his response that no reasonable prosecutor would bring charges. As good as the job that you are doing, my question to you would be, is there any room that if there was other investigations or if there was other inspections, if you will, would people, do you feel like, do you agree with James Comey on your conclusion that this would be the same conclusion, or is there room that other people, other investigators may find different conclusions?
You know, I think as you've seen in commentary about the findings in the report, what we try to lay out, this was the policy, this is how they reached the decision, and others are free to disagree with that.
When it comes to the number of FBI employees who were in contact with the journalists, was it the FBI employee or the reporter who seemed to initiate contacts that resulted in this back-and-forth conversation, or did they seem like long-term relationships?
Some of them, based on what we've, seen, did not seem like a, well, let me just, looking at the charts here, you can see these are not, generally speaking, one call. So I would leave it at that. We're looking at that deeper question.
When you say you're looking at it, does that mean there may be may warrant more investigations for some of those who've been players in this situation?
There are active investigations ongoing by our office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman from North Carolina yields back. The gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by lamenting the fact that we are not having a judiciary oversight hearings to address this barbaric child separation policy. I just came back from Brownsville, Texas, and McAllen. It is despicable what is happening in our name. We're not having bills to address dozens of ideas to reduce gun violence in this country. We're not marking up the DREAM Act. We're not marking up legislation to protect the special counsel or to protect our elections from foreign interference. But alas, we're having another hearing on the Clinton emails. So let me just start with Mr. Horowitz with this basic question. Your investigation was to focus on the investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails, correct?
Correct.
And was part of your investigation to examine whether the Trump campaign colluded with the Russians?
That was not part of this investigation.
Did you investigate or make findings about collusive behavior between the Trump campaign and the Russians?
The only matter we touched on with Russia was that October matter, nothing.
So I take it as a no. And was part of your investigation to review whether the President of the United States obstructed justice during the course of the special counsel's investigation?
We didn't. We looked at the Clinton
That's a yes
email
or a no.
investigation.
Was that part of your investigation?
It was not.
Okay. And you didn't make any investigation or findings related to the president's potential obstruction of justice. Is that correct?
It had nothing to do with
Okay.
this investigation.
So the president's claim that your report makes clear that he's completely exonerated, there's no obstruction of justice, and no evidence of collusion is a lie, or at least unsupported by your report.
Our report focused on.
Does your
Clinton email
report in any way support the president's claim that he's completely exonerated, there's no evidence of collusion, no evidence of obstruction of justice? The answer is no.
Our investigation focused on the Clinton email investigation.
And so your report does not contain any findings, not a single one in 500 pages, that would support the president's claim that your report, authored by you, exonerates him fully, presents evidence of no collusion and no obstruction of justice. Isn't that correct?
I'm going to focus on our report, and there are
Mr.
individuals.
Horowitz, the truth matters. Can you say in open
Congressman,
that this, no, I'll finish my question. I get to ask the questions. Will you admit in open session that your report does not support the claim from the President of the United States that he is completely exonerated, that there's no evidence of collusion between his campaign and the Russians, and that there's no evidence of obstruction of justice? Your report does not investigate or make findings on those issues at all, does it?
We do not make findings on
Okay,
those.
so that would mean that's not a truthful statement. I'm not asking you to say that. I know it's hard for you to do that. But it's the president. I get it. But it's important that the American people know that the 500 pages that you dedicated your career to developing with professionals does not support any such claim by the president. I'm not asking you for an answer. That's a statement. Yeah. Let me go next, Mr. Horowitz, to the part of your investigation that focuses on you may have heard the president and many of his allies make numerous statements about your report that were designed to make the American people believe the opposite of what is obvious from your report's findings, that the FBI's actions had an impact on the 2000 presidential election and in Donald Trump's favor. Your report found no evidence that the FBI or DOJ's conclusions in the investigation of Secretary Clinton's emails were politically motivated. And your report found that Director Comey violated Department of Justice policies by speaking publicly about Secretary Clinton's closed case in July of 2006 and by disclosing the reopening of the investigation in October of 2016. Isn't that correct?
Certainly the latter part.
That violated department policy?
Yes.
Okay.
The earlier part I was...
Okay. And your report discusses why the Justice Department and the FBI have a policy and practice of refusing to speak publicly about ongoing investigative activity. It explains the stay silent principle exists to protect the privacy and reputational interests of the subjects of the investigation, and also the department's ability to effectively administer justice without political or undue outside influence, correct?
Correct.
And would you agree that the FBI, when the FBI speaks publicly about an ongoing case, it risks harming a subject's reputational interests?
Correct.
And in this case, that subject of potential harm was Hillary Clinton.
Correct.
Your report, Mr. Horowitz, also has a subsection entitled Avoiding the Perception that the FBI Concealed the New Information to Help Clinton Win the Election. In that section, Director Comey says his decision to disclose the investigation reopening was to avoid, quote, corrosive doubt that you had engineered a cover-up to protect a particular candidate. Your report found, however, that Director Comey, quote, and this is your words, did not assess risks even-handedly. In weighing his actions, did Director Comey ever express fear that his notification to Congress would tip the scales, or at least appear to tip the scales, against Hillary Clinton in favor of Donald Trump?
I don't recall him saying that to us as
sort
of one of his explanations.
But Director Comey was afraid that if he stayed silent about the reopening of the case, that we would unfairly be accused of helping Hillary Clinton. Isn't that correct?
That was one of the concerns he expressed.
And so, sir, when the president said, when he praised Director Comey's actions, when he made that disclosure and said it took guts for Director Comey to make the move that he made, and, quote, what he did was the right thing, Chairman Goodlatte said he was very appreciative that Director Comey had the courage to step forward, and our very own Chairman Gowdy went on to Fox News and stated, Director Comey did the right thing in supplementing his testimony. Isn't it true, Mr. Horowitz, just to reiterate, your report concludes Director Comey's October 26th notification to Congress was not the right thing?
Yes, on October 28th.
That's
correct.
Right. And so I hope the Justice Department and the FBI learned their lesson from your report and do not cave to the ongoing bullying of President Trump and his allies in Congress. Instead, they must once again uphold longstanding principles and the rule of law, even while facing the onslaught of unfair political attacks. We expect nothing less of you. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Since my name was invoked, before we go to the gentleman from Texas, I would just point out that we don't live in a binary world. You can notify Congress without writing a letter that is publicly disseminated. You have other options, including notifying Congress in a confidential manner. With that, the former United States Attorney from Texas, Mr. Ratcliffe.
Thank you, Chairman. Inspector Horowitz, in your report and now in your testimony, you said that you are deeply troubled and very concerned that the anti-Trump bias reflected in the Strzok page text messages was so great as to have possibly impacted Peter Strzok's conduct in the Wiener laptop part of the Hillary Clinton investigation. Is that fair?
Correct.
So if the Department of Justice and the FBI's own Inspector General is very concerned and deeply troubled about Peter Strzok's anti-Trump bias affecting his actions as an FBI agent, is it unreasonable for President Trump, as the subject of an investigation, to likewise be very concerned and deeply troubled that Mr. Strzok was put in charge of the Trump-Russia investigation?
I'm going to step back on that, Congressman, and speak to the broader point that that's precisely why we were concerned, generally speaking, about the election review, that those kind of messages create that appearance of bias that undercuts credibility and the ability to do investigation. I can't speak to
right.
Russia.
Well, I'm not asking you to make any findings about the Trump-Russia matter. I'm asking you about the people that you investigated in your report, people whose actions you found so deeply troubling and very concerning. I just want to find out if you think it's unreasonable for the President to feel the same way you do.
My concern on that is, as you know, we're currently reviewing that, and I want to be careful. I don't want to be myself seen as prejudging any outcomes here. So I'm going to let folks draw what reasonable inferences they want to draw from this, but I don't want to be seen as making any judgments on that.
Well, do you think it's unreasonable for President Trump to be very concerned or deeply troubled, as you were, that 8 days after Peter Strzok was put in charge of the Trump-Russia investigation, that he promised another FBI employee, Lisa Page, that Trump would never be president because he'd stop it?
I think any individual in this country should be concerned about that kind of language.
And the reason you're concerned about that, Inspector General, I think, is because you've said numerous times here that Strzok's stated bias and stated willingness to act on that bias are antithetical to the core values of the FBI, correct? Another thing that's antithetical to the FBI and the Department of Justice and our entire justice system is putting people in charge of investigating people they hate, of people that they are biased against and that they are prejudiced against, right?
Correct.
And we don't do that in our justice system. We can't do that in our justice system, a system where the bedrock principle has to be the fair and impartial administration of justice free from bias and prejudice, right?
Correct.
So I think the point that you're making and that I agree with is that anyone, you, me, any member of Congress, any American who becomes the subject of an investigation should not be investigated by people who have sent hundreds of hateful text messages about them before the investigation ever began and then continued to send them while the investigation was occurring. That is by definition prejudicial to the fair and impartial administration of justice, isn't it?
I think that is precisely the concern.
And yet that is exactly what happened to President Trump. Now, to your credit, Inspector Horowitz, you revealed the astonishing level, the outrageous level of bias and prejudice, and when you did, Special Counsel Mueller removed Peter Strzok from the case. But you and I are former prosecutors, and you and I both know that it is impossible to remove bias and prejudice from all of the actions taken, all of the decisions made, all of the investigative plans implemented, all of the evidence gathered by Peter Strzok and at least 2 other Trump-hating FBI agents and lawyers who were assigned to the investigation. That's pretty hard to do, isn't it?
Well, that is precisely the question, as you know, we're looking at.
So my colleagues over there just keep pointing out that your report doesn't state any conclusions about the Trump-Russia investigation. And they're right. The report doesn't state any conclusions. But your findings of fact about the people in charge of the Trump-Russia investigation, in the case of Peter Strzok, for 9 months, the person in charge of the investigation, well, that leads to all sorts of undeniable conclusions about pervasive bias and prejudice against President Trump by the people who never, ever should have been in charge of gathering evidence against him. Let me switch topics in the remaining 20 seconds that I have. Did Jim Comey make the decision not to prosecute Hillary Clinton before or after her July 2nd, 2016 interview?
I'm going to let you answer the question, even though the gentleman from Texas grossly misjudged the amount of time he does not have left anymore. It's actually 20 seconds over rather than under, but you can answer the question.
As we laid out here and described here, prior to the July 2nd interview, absent, as we were told, either a confession or a false statements, the decision had been made to close the investigation.
So the fact that Director Comey testified under oath to members of Congress in response to a question about whether or not the decision was made before or after, unequivocally stated after, do you think it's reasonable for members of Congress to think that they were misled by that answer?
I'd probably have to look at the transcript. As you know, so much of that turns on the precise question and answer. So
can I take that as a promise to look at that?
I'll take a look at the question and answer, and then we can talk further, Congressman, about that.
Thank you, Inspector Horowitz. Appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Horowitz, for being here. I want to commend you and your team for a very thorough report. You've taken extreme care to make sure you don't jump to conclusions. You've indicated where the lines are between judgment, acting in accordance with various protocols and norms and rules of the department and so forth. You've indicated that the bias that you've identified did not affect or contaminate the investigative decisions that were being made at the highest levels, which is important. When you focus on Jim Comey and his conduct, you point to issues of compliance with department guidelines and norms and standards that you think are very important. I think that's valid. I think it's also important to observe that that doesn't in any way get to the question of the credibility or truthfulness of an individual. You could say, this person is not adhering to what we think is a departmental standard. That doesn't go to whether they're being truthful, to their basic credibility and so forth. If I didn't comply with a rule on how much time I'm supposed to take here and asking you a question, then I went out in the hall and I saw someone knock someone else over and run down the hall, and I wanted to testify to that, you wouldn't say, I'm not going to believe you because you didn't follow the clock when you were in the hearing. And that's important because it may be that Jim Comey down the line becomes a witness in various contexts. And there's nothing in your report that I see, and I think you said this in response to Congressman Cohen, that would suggest that you have any reason to think that he has lied, that he misled you, that he was not truthful in the course of your conducting this investigation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, I wanted to move to the question of, as I step away from this and I sort of don't consider particular individuals, but look at the standards you're articulating for what's a good investigation and how to carry it out, you've identified a variety of things. First of all, follow the rules that exist, be consistent in following those. That's one of the major concerns you had in terms of the process for taking certain decisions on investigations. So be consistent, follow the rules. Another thing you've talked about is the importance of there not being leaks. and you've identified some issues with that at the FBI. But that is also, that goes to the overall legitimacy of an investigation, that there not be leaks. You've talked about the issue of bias, and I assume that your expectation would be that a good investigation would be one where if there's evidence of bias in a way that could affect the investigation, that steps need to be taken to address that bias.
Correct. Or the appearance, potentially.
Or the appearance of bias. So stepping away from that and thinking about those kinds of standards on how an investigation should proceed, you've actually left me in a position of being, having a lot of confidence in the way Bob Mueller is conducting his investigation. Because if you take those standards that you are highlighting and you apply them to how he and his team are conducting themselves, he passes with flying colors. Where there's been evidence of bias, he's taken steps. In fact, you acknowledge that Ms. Page, Mr. Strzok are not part of that team anymore because he took quick action when there was evidence of bias or even the appearance of bias. There's no suggestion that there have been improper leaks from this investigation. And by all accounts, both Bob Mueller and Rod Rosenstein are following to the T the rules and standards that ought to apply to investigation. So I want to thank you and your team for describing a set of standards for how to conduct an investigation, because I think when you take that set of standards and you apply it to the way Bob Mueller is conducting his investigation, you can see that he's doing it in a diligent, conscientious way as a straight arrow, and that's why I think we need to support that investigation. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Horowitz, for being here. In late September of 2016, the FBI came into possession of the Anthony Weiner laptop, which contained hundreds of thousands of potentially emails related to the Clinton investigation. My first question, would you say that this discovery was rapidly communicated with the midterm Clinton investigation team and the FBI, or was it slow-walked?
The New York office promptly reported it to the mid-year Clinton investigation team.
Okay, and when did Peter Strzok, of course, he was leading the Clinton investigation, when was he made aware of the laptop?
On September 28th.
All right, so the next day or close within days. All right, so this is the same Peter Strzok has come up in multiple ways, repeatedly bashed candidate Trump at that time, and then committed to stop him from becoming president. Now, from from the perspective of his superiors, Bill Priestap, for example, was he at this time committed to the Clinton investigation, or was his focus more on the Russian investigation?
At the time of September 28th and 9th, Mr. Strzok was working on the Russia investigation.
And Mr. Priestap, I mean,
and his supervisor was working not just on that, but as you might expect as Assistant Director of Counterintelligence, a wide variety of matters as we lay out here.
Right. On page 297 of your report, Priestap said that the Weiner laptop was not his top priority at this time due to his involvement in the Russian investigation. You said that Priestap himself said that, I don't want to say distracted, but yeah, my focus wasn't on the mid-year anymore, and Strzok himself was assigned to both the Russian and Clinton investigations at this point, but he was still the lead in the Clinton investigation. So it's fair to say by your report that the superiors were distracted at this time. They were not focused on the mid-year investigation, but on the Russian investigation.
Correct. And to be clear for Mr. Priestap, he was also talking about the election interference issues more broadly than just what has now come to be known as the Russia.
Which adds to the whole scenario that he was distracted. His focus was not on the Clinton investigation anymore. So here we go back to Strzok. All right, he is presented now with a choice. He receives the information from the discovery of the Wiener laptop, hundreds of thousands of emails potentially damaging and at least related to the Clinton investigation. He has a choice now to either follow up on the leads from that laptop and report them in a timely manner, or, knowing that his superiors are distracted, he can conveniently place this laptop discovery on the back burner. And so how long did it take Strzok and the mid-year team to finally get around to the laptop?
So there was activity the next day, September 29th, and then there was some discussions back and forth up through October 3rd or 4th, and then no activity whatsoever until the New York field office again raised the concern on October 21st, ultimately, or around October 21st, ultimately resulting in a call on October 21st from the U.S. Attorney's Office from the Southern District of New York to the Deputy Attorney General's office, inquiring about why there's been no activity.
So Strzok was taking this slow. I mean, he did not report it in a timely manner and pursue this thing. It was only after the New York group pushed it that Strzok got on board and said, we've got to do something about this.
Strzok and others, yes.
All right, but that's the timeline in all of this. And so, I mean, from every appearance, he did everything he could to prevent this discovery from becoming public because it may hurt the Clinton campaign. And you yourself stated that you could not, with any confidence, say that Strzok's political bias did not lead him to delay looking at the laptop. Do you still stand by that?
Yes.
Okay, so this is where the whole cycle comes back to me, where every appearance and action by Strzok at this point is that his political bias did, in fact, prevent him from bringing forth this information because it may hurt the Clinton campaign. And this is precisely, really one of the big things that to me is just the elephant in the room, where there not only was political bias, but action based on that bias to protect one individual over the other, Clinton over Trump. And this is the same Strzok who is leading the Russian investigation, which of course is the foundation of the Mueller special counsel. So tremendous concern here. Again, I thank you for being here, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Inspector General Horowitz, how about we take a 10-minute break and then recess and then reconvene?
Whatever's good for the committee.
Does that suit you?
Don't
10 minutes?
me.
10 minutes, we'll reconvene.
Okay.